how do you see the discourse of this war in future? Do you think that Ukraine requires more futuristic weapons, such as the army tactical missile systems, or probably more funding for the F-16 fighter jets, perhaps more support from the NATO members? What are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Said. Yeah, and thanks for organising this, and also for getting such a great panel together on diverse expertise. So well done. And I'm sorry I can't stay for the Q&A, but if anyone wants to ping me an email or anything over anything I cover, I suppose, like, just in the whatever 6 minutes or so that we have, the thing to talk about really is, first of all, outline how has the war gone so far. And you can think of it we're probably in the fifth phase, running into the sixth somewhere now. So the first phase was the invasion, up to the withdrawal in April, May, from Kiev, and then the second phase would be the Russian focus on the Donbass, essentially, and Mariupol. Then you move into the third phase, which is the Ukrainian counterattacks, first of all in Kharkiv, and then a much more slow grinding one in Kherson, which brings us up to sort of November this time last year or so, the Russian withdrawal. Then you've got the fourth phase, which is the battle for Bakhmut over the winter, and then the fifth phase essentially transitions from that into the Ukrainian much anticipated counterattack. And that kind of brings us up to where we are now. We're probably going to enter into the sixth phase as we start to roll towards winter. And if we focus in on that fifth phase, the Ukrainian counterattack, someone who was, and my initial thoughts were, given the training that the Ukrainians got, and given that the motivation and will to fight that they had, and given the morale problems that have been clearly evident in the Russian forces, especially in Kharkiv, that I thought and given the new Western weapons, which were probably over-egged a bit, but that they would break the line somewhere in a significant operational way. And therefore, that would probably come in the south, and they might make it. I was hoping they'd make it to Melitopol and certainly to Tokmak. And a lot of people who watched it thought that at the time, were pretty optimistic that somewhere it would happen. And that has not proven the case, unfortunately. And at great cost and with great bravery, the Ukrainians have tried. But it simply has been too hard to do. And why is that hard to do? Well, essentially what we're seeing in warfare at the moment is the defense is in the ascendancy because of the ubiquitous nature of sensors, of drones, the ability to collect, the difficulty dispersing and communicating, and the danger of massing forces, because of both sides are good and getting better, and the Ukrainians were best first, and now the Russians are getting better at directing fires, what we call either missiles, artillery, drone attacks, etc., onto anything that's identified and masked, and so therefore it becomes very difficult to kind of generate the mass you need to break through lines. That's the more broad piece of what's going on in warfare at the moment. The lower level is that probably by those nuclear escalationary threats that Putin made in sort of summer last year, especially, and a little bit before, he probably, the net effect of those was to scare, I think, especially the Germans about nuclear escalation, also to a degree the Biden administration, and therefore the aid which has come to Ukraine, which has been great by both the EU and the US, has come in salami-sliced packages with great sort of hand-wringing about whether it should happen or not. And hence, to answer your question about the tanks, first of all, the F-16s, the ATACMS, the rules of the game here, which have been proven over the 20th century at least, is that actually, even in a Cold War setting, global nuclear superpowers can get involved conventionally and up to nearly all of their conventional forces in a partner nation without it escalating. Now, of course, it has risks, and everyone is limiting their wars. But generally, and I've had this, clarified to me by senior former members of the US government, generally the rules of the game are that if one nation, an adversary, invades a partner nation with all their conventional forces, it is seen as reasonable to respond with all your conventional forces without putting your own boots on the ground there to help them. So that's salami slicing. The Ukrainians knew what they needed back in April. In hindsight, and it's 2020, it led to a situation where when it came to the early part of this summer, May, and the start of the counterattacks, June, the Russians had actually had enough time to build these very formidable defensive lines. And the amount of mines they laid, the amount of trenches they've dug, their ability to use attack helicopters, basically made it too difficult for what were freshly trained, actually, Ukrainian brigades, some of which performed and some of which really did not perform, unfortunately. So that's where we are, and they have not made tactical, or they haven't made anything more than tactical gains. I would be surprised now. I would hope it could happen, but I'd be pleasantly surprised if it did happen between now and the next couple of weeks, when things are probably going to slow down. We've had the Russians launch what was probably the largest counterattack we've seen since January, in the Battle of Bakhmut in Avdiivka, which again proved that point that if you try to mass armor and break through, guess what? You get blown up, and they lost about 70 vehicles. It was a little bit hairy for a while. The Ukrainians thought they might break through, but they haven't, and that's in Donetsk. And so you're left with the situation, the political situation, with a lot of elections coming up. I don't think the Ukrainian one will probably happen. It doesn't seem there's an appetite for it, but certainly there's ones. We've seen Slovakia already say after their election they're not going to support Ukrainian military aid any further. You've got Orban calling for peace in the EU. You've got the American elections, and Republican support for the war in particular at a low ebb. You've got the world distracted by the Israel-Hamas conflict. So that those sort of political things are in play, and ultimately this is a war. It's two armies that actually fight in a fairly centralized way, are heavily reliant on attrition. We've got as Alessia said, you've got a Russian strategy which is now focused on just lasting out the West and hoping politics will change, that they can grind it out. We've seen in the manning of the Russian defenses that actually, some of their units don't have good morale, but Russia has won plenty of wars with bad morale in their forces. It doesn't matter, and they have guard forces behind. And so I think to set the context and then answer your question, F-16s take, depending on the currency of the pilot, can take anywhere from, say, an English-speaking, highly current pilot for maybe 6 weeks to fly and operate it on its own or with one wingman. But when you're talking about, formation level, so you're talking about squadrons of F-16s, which are needed to defeat a layered and highly capable Russian air defense system, that's of a complexity much higher. And we won't even see the introduction of, I'd say, a few F-16s until February, March. Whether they ever have enough of the ability to kind of take on Russian air defense systems, first of all, to start gaining even local air superiority, I don't know. There's a big question mark over that. ATACMS, again, an early request from the Ukrainians, mainly to do with the larger warhead variant, which hasn't been supplied because the US needs. One reason is the US needs stockpiles of them for a China contingency, and they were really asked for and became part of the debate around the Kerch Bridge and the ability to destroy hardened targets in Russian occupied Ukraine. The Storm Shadow and the French equivalent has sort of taken away from that a bit. So they've given them the cluster munition of the ATACMS, which is useful for targets in the open. But to me, the ATACMS, it's a little bit of a moot question now that they have Storm Shadow. But we'll see how that develops. I think, unfortunately, if so, what are the things that can change? One, political will on either side. There can be a change, if we've seen with the Prigozhin mutiny or the Kootenai. There can be a rapid political change on either side. We could see the same in the US. If those, so take that into account. There could be, I think, much more likely there still potentially, for some reason, there could be a collapse of Russian morale, but I don't think that's going to happen now. if those constraints stay the same, so the politics on both sides and the Russian morale, then I think we're settling into a long war, certainly in 2024 and out to 2025, where production of artillery and the continuing supply and basically the West ramping up, which will start to hit towards the end of 2024. You know, they've got the factories going, but they'll need more. It's going to come into a battle of attrition. I would be surprised. I wouldn't be like the Russians will attempt to attack, and I wouldn't be surprised if they take some ground somewhere. And same with the Ukrainians. But unless something changes significantly, we're in for a slog.
Yeah, that is all that we required. Just a short comment before I move on to Matt. Who do you think is gonna gain more territories out of the war? Maybe just in the coming months. Is it gonna be Ukraine or Russia? Like just a realistic approach.
Okay, so you know, and I'm not Ukrainian, and I'm totally respectful for the sort of nothing without Ukraine, but I'm also not, you know, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, but I'm also not a politician, so I'll be frank. I think the most likely outcome for this war now is something similar enough to the lines they're on, and I think it would be probably what would you call it, like almost like an unfrozen conflict. You're thinking about Korea, but without the actual ceasefire potentially, or with a ceasefire that's breached all the time because Putin will keep doing that if Putin's around, or his successor would keep firing on the border area to stop Ukraine joining NATO. On a more positive element, if you think about what a nation is, it's a nation. The definition of a nation is usually a population forged by violence and the myth of itself in violence. And I think Ukraine has actually achieved that. If you look at what Maidan was about, and unfortunately, hopefully, I would love to see it take back the southern coast and become more, what's the word, sort of coherent territorially. But